Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we're bringing you a special stream by Alpha Media with two financial analysts, Daniil Monin and Anatoly Yurkevich. These guys analyzed different financial projects in Ukraine, and recently their eyes fell onto the budget of 2024, and they pose very interesting questions whether it has seriously Ukrainian priorities at heart. Our special thanks go to our members, of course, John Afseth and Clever Pittsburgh. Thank you guys for continuous support. And Bill, thank you for your super thanks. You totally rock. Okay, with this, let's go into an economic stream. Here it goes. Enjoy. This is Project Alpha, an evening stream. My name is Nikolai Feldman. Daniil Monin, Anatoly Yurkevich are with us for the first time. Anatoly and Daniil are colleagues. They work together on different financial analytical projects. Here in Ukraine, we got acquainted with Anatoly about a month ago, and we started talking to them about the budget of 2024. They analyzed this rather thoroughly, priorities and interesting goals. And the questions we're posing tonight, whether our next year budget for 2024 in Ukraine is indeed pro-Ukrainian. Does it have Ukrainian interests at heart? All right, let me start with the background first. We have a situation when a number of companies are working on the territory of Ukraine, and they essentially create the main income for our budget. And then there is a situation when a hired manager is getting rent from these profits, from these proceeds, from these companies to direct them to certain areas that need attention. And budget doesn't exist to reflect the interests of certain people, of groups. It exists to invest money to develop our branches of our industry and to support our social payments and the structure of our country. Unfortunately, if we speak about the activity of that hired manager, it has a lot of interesting things that are not often brought to light. It's rather intricate, but it's not going to be the topic of today's conversation. So we understand the scale. We had about 373,000 companies in 2020, plus private entrepreneurs about 1.6 million. And basically, this group of about 2 million entities are making a profit that the whole country is fed from. This creates the budget for the country. We have expense lines in the budget. We have international classification of International Monetary Fund that we often use, how we calculate our budget and our expense lines. And one of the most prominent lines recently, in light of war, is defense. And in the situation that we have some data for 22, we have 9 months of 23. I can say that on average, we used to spend 6 to 7% from our budget, and that it's constituted about $3 to $4 billion a year. Now we changed it. Now we spend about 20% of our income, of about budgetary income, and that's about 8 to 9 billion. And if we look at the data of 22, we spent overall about $33 billion for war, when Russia spent about 120 billions. So our effectivity, if we're spending less, we need to be higher, right? At least 3 times higher. For every dollar that we spend, we need to destroy $3 that the enemy spends. In 2023, our situation on the incomes and spending is a little better. Looking at the 9 months that we have, Daniil can probably concur, we spent about 40 billion. Again, from that amount, about 8 billion are money from Ukraine, and the rest is financial aid by our allies. And what you in your stream with Vladimir Zelenin were talking about, the future of Ukraine. The only system that has stability has some future. And stability in financial world is when your expenses are covered by your income. When you're not standing out at the corner with a cup collecting money. On 2024, we are planning to spend less money on defense than in 2023. Yet it still is about 20% from all the income. And in this situation, we have only two pathways. We either need to help the companies grow their income, the ones that are still working, help them find people who can help them make more money, or we need to diminish our expenses. And generally, we have to probably be doing both. Because as we see, looking at the scandals of 2023, investment expenses of the budget were not cut. The sports facilities were built, cities were beautified, and there were more scandals. Even though this money could be spent to cover our military expenses, and if we did so, the other articles of the budget would stay bare. It's a question of priority, and that is a question that is directed by the person who is in charge of all that. Yeah, thank you. I think it changes a little. So look, all budgets in Ukraine always were copycatting the budget of a previous year, year over year. It is a known fact that we don't have war, we're doing budget as usual. But the basis for the budget of the next year was usually taken from the prognosis based on the previous year. Or sometimes they take the facts, the incomes of the previous year, and they build new numbers on that. So in this case, they're not talking about any optimization practically, but I still have to acknowledge that the budget of 2024 is rather a militarized one, because despite that, visibly, the numbers of money, the amounts of money for defense is lesser compared to the current expenses, other current expenses. So in the budget, we have now 1.2, 1.3 trillion hryvnias, which is about $3.3 billion. And yet, just in 9 months of 22, we've spent about $5 billion already. But we also need to understand that our military expenses in the budget are not only ours, right? Very often, they're not just Ukrainian money being spent on the war effort. On my estimations, just this year, only military help will constitute, and I'm talking about tanks, HIMARS, artillery shells, and other equipment, worth of about $20 billion. And that also will be included in the expenses of the Defense Ministry budget. So our own expenses that we finance, I think, are salaries to our military and some parts of the internal military programs, which are unfortunately rather small. Everything else, and of course the budget deficit, is being covered by the Western allies. And even though one can say that that support was not enough, because if you compare the numbers of how much was brought by Russia to the front line and how much the West did supply to Ukraine, we can see that we have some parity maybe in artillery shells. Everything else, we are definitely supplying to the front 3 or 5 times less than Russians do in equipment. And that definitely does not allow us to conduce successful counter-offensive actions at a large scale. And that's where we are, according to recent publications. And here we're coming to 2024, and I can see some changes. Maybe they're not big, but they definitely exist. What they are. So first, we start to minimize ineffective capital expenses, at least slightly. In the budget code, we have a concept of funding. So if you have a reserved funding, let's say excise tax is going to the road repairs, right? Because the budget has certain rules, and everything that comes from a certain taxation goes directly into the budget to repair the roads. And until you cut that connection, until you actually manually go there and redirect that flow, that stream into military expenses, that will not happen. And I'm seeing some of that being changed. So this is already partially an optimization of resources, the ones that we do not have to use now immediately. We can use to repair things later. Also, in the next year budget, a program worth of about $1 billion was removed. This is a program to restore restorative construction, and I agree we probably should be restoring things only after the war. Now we just need to restore the critical infrastructure elements and not restoration at large. Also, the fact that military income from salaries from physical persons in the military was transferred from local regions budget to the federal budget. This is also a step to fight some maraudering. Basically, when local budgets get certain profit points, and for today I think they have it at about 100 billion hryvnias, which is about $300 million, they start to look for different places where they want to spend it. When they have too much profit locally, especially in times of war, they start looking for ways to spend it, and they sometimes find it creatively. And I think that exactly was the reason for most of scandals when local administrations were building monuments, beautifying stadiums, and spending money unwisely in the times of war, given that the federal budget is at huge deficit. Right, at the same time, nobody on the level of president comes out with restricting local budgets that they should not spend money, right? So president doesn't come out and say, don't. Right, in 22, I think we had a restriction for some of the capital investments, but it still brought to 70 billion hryvnias profit of the local budgets. So they really were gorging on that money locally. In 24, they removed it. So for me, I see that there is a change. And I think local budgets in 2024 will definitely not be in the green. And that will be a significant resource, maybe 100, 120 billion hryvnias, or about $3.3 billion. And this definitely will increase the money we can spend to increase our effectivity fighting the war. There is also another article, line of budget purchases by Ministry of Defense, which is generally non-transparent line, and there are also quite a few scandals around that. But in general, I can say that we lose in the organizational ability to conduct quality purchasing. And all these scandals about lack of drones and lack of certain munitions and articles for the warfighters, the main reason for that, I would say, besides, of course, the corruption that is pervasive, there is also a lot of bureaucracy in Ministry of Defense, and it's also very closed, so you can't really verify and check numbers. And that means that the money that will come from local budgets, they actually were put on a different line outside of Ministry of Defense lines that are concealed. So in the final rendition that I've seen, they'll spend about $1.3 billion. The amount was shrunk a little for drones purchasing. And also Ministry of Economy, I think, also has a similar program to facilitate purchasing for the inner Ukrainian production of military nomenclature. And I think this is a move towards military economy, an attempt to solve organizational problems which are holding our military potential. And basically we're trying to not let ourselves loose by making these shifts. And that's probably all that I can say about changes of military budget in brief for 2024. But overall, if you look at the overall expenses of 2024, then you have to note here that even now, without Western financing, our general budget, the consolidated government expenses, will be roughly 4.4 trillion hryvnias, and for the war fighting, we'll spend maybe 1.2, 1.3. So we're spending only about 25% for defense. Everything else, yeah, is kind of spread around. Yeah, we live like we lived before, generally. And I want to highlight here that there are definite increases in two articles for the next year. First of all, it's social payments and pensions. We'll be spending a trillion hryvnias, which is roughly about $27 billion, which is a huge amount, in my view. In a good 2021, we spent only about half of that. Now we've been fighting the war for about 2 years almost. In 24 it'll be starting a third year, and we'll be spending 807 billion. So this is roughly a 60% increase from a good year to a war year of pensions and payments. So in my view, it means one of two things. And then, in 24 they increase it by another 15%. So we either are going into elections and somebody wants to raise their ratings with the public and raise their chances for re-election because we're not making that much to pay that much. Or they have other plans for these money. But still, if we spend 1.3 billion for defense out of 4.4 billion that we have, it's still a lot of left in reserve that we could use to increase our defense capabilities. And I also want to light our attention to general line of our fiscal politics that we are generally moving towards default. So you mean that we'll not be able to carry out responsibilities taken upon ourselves in this budget? Not only in the budget, also for servicing the debt. The problem is that in the budget of 2024, we have only in percent to service the debts that we have are 420 billion hryvnias, which is more than the line articles for medicine and education in our federal budget. So it's $10 billion just in percent on the loans that we took. This amount is understandable. It consists of two pieces. 5 billion of them are on the internal debt that we accrued. And partially the reason for that is that we were printing some money at the beginning. And then the second one is that National Bank continues to hold rather high interest rates, and inflation now is fallen to 6%. They're actually expecting it to be not more than 5%. But deposit certificates are still generating 20%. And as I can say, fat banking, when in practice real sector of economy is suppressed and suffers losses, but the banks are making record profits and are sucking about 100 billion hryvnias from the federal budget. And this is one of the articles where I think we could optimize our expenses as well. What is also now in the budget of 24 that can also be shrunk is payment on the external loans, because in 22 and 23 we did not pay part of European bonds in agreement with the Western partners. But it seems like now they just put everything into 1 year, 23 and 24, that we'll need to cover with payments in 2024. So if we manage to come to an agreement to defer these payments to the future, then we can maybe save additional 100 billion hryvnias for the next year. And that also increases our buoyancy overall. But in general, if you look at the effectiveness of the use of resources, and that Anatoly is raising that question, how can we increase the effectivity of our monetary spendings? I think that on one hand, we need to already start looking at the future of our federal infrastructure, because our infrastructure was designed to service 50, maybe 51 million people who lived here in the 90s. Right now, we will probably have about 30, maybe, and that's optimistically 35 or maybe 25 million people. We absolutely lack in children right now. Most of them were moved by their parents outside of the war zones and out of the country. Then you come with questions: do we need the same number of schools, kindergartens, and medical facilities, and utilities, federal government utilities companies on the local levels too? So we could probably come with a thorough calm and locally try to solve it. I also think that this question cannot be determined on the government level, on the federal level. Right, they should determine the priorities. Exactly, priorities, but specific schools, that will be up to each locale to figure it out. And there's a general position, I think it's from the head of committee in the Congress on Science, Sergei Babakan, I think. Our school system is double of the German school system, and yet we have half the students studying here. So we generally have a potential to shrink it by 4 times, right? Oh, that's true. Before the war, we had 500,000 teachers for 4 million school children. And now we'll have maybe 2 million school children, roughly speaking. And where or what will those 500,000 teachers do? So roughly 4 students per teacher, right? Yeah, it looks like that with numbers. So you either optimize or you're wasting resources that you already are lacking for in other parts. So you're just wasting them. There are 2 ways to optimize, I think. You can decentralize, basically let go on a federal level and let in each locale to figure it out themselves. Because there are places, there are still schools where some schools are teaching kids in 2 shifts because people moved. And there are schools that are empty, that nobody even goes to because people left. The other approach would be a centralized, so similar like Russia does. When the top gives a command, everybody pretends that they're executing the command. But in developed countries, schools are usually combined together with responsibilities of the local powers. So in the United States, schools are funded by municipalities. The presence of a good school usually rises the price of real estate significantly. Right, so cities are interested in having good schools. Exactly. It's districts in the city or city itself. So basically, parents make a decision to invest in children because children are generally an investment. It's a long investment for 22, 23 years, which may eventually bring some fruit. So these people who decide to invest in the future, they need some help from the system. And Daniil outlined the general pathways rather clearly. But I have one question. When I was serving in the military, we had one ironclad rule. If you miss the goal jumping across the ravine by 5 inches, it is not almost 5 inches success. It is a loss. You still have not jumped across the ravine. Right, we understand that. So, is it enough money for that we have to become self-sustainable and to resist Russia? Right, we're not talking about investment, we're talking about survival here, about keeping sovereignty. Because Russia continues to spend 110, 120 billion dollars a year, and they're ready to spend that much money for the next 3, 4, 5 years. So if we successfully fought last year when the coefficient was 1 to 3, we need to maintain the same efficiency going forward if we are spending that much. But problem is Russia is learning. They're building UAVs, they're building radio electronic defense systems. So we also need to learn to be able to spend money more effectively. Otherwise, we'll need to increase our monetary investments in this war. And 40 billion for our budget, for our own income, it's about 90% of our income. I think it was more than a budget in a good year. No. In 21, we had overall about 70 billion, $73 billion. That was our budget. But we also lost several territories. We lost some companies. We lost some significant companies, big ones, that were generating a significant amount of profit. And of course, our profits overall dropped. According to the stats, in 2022, we only made 40 billion. From 73, we went down to 40. Right, if not to include grants and other support. Right, we're talking about what we can rely ourselves. What you talked about with Vladimir Zelenin. So, being a subject, when you are self-sufficient enough, you can plan your own destiny. When you request donations all the time and you see no horizon, when you will become self-sustainable, then you're not a subject. You're basically an infant. You're a child. You have not developed to the level when you are an adult, when you're responsible for your own life with your own resources. So yeah, you're like asking your dad for money all the time, right? From European Union or from United States, anyone who will answer. So it's like in the anecdote, a new Russian comes to an old Jew and says, "Daddy, please give me money." Right, something like that. So I don't know if it's correct to post a question, but I will take slide number 1, for example. These are the main expense lines in the budget. You can see on the screen. Let's take a look. Ministry of Defense is the first line. Actually, no, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, the big one, like this. The changes of expenses year to year. Well, problem here is manipulation. Because when you are doing business, you have operational flow, operational stream, that the one that feeds you, where you take money from to invest. And there's also a financial stream, an investment stream. Here in this picture, all 3 streams are combined in one big bulk. So in order to understand it better, you need to actually separate it into 3 streams, and then you can start analyzing. Then you can see what you can take for the war expenses from here. I think there are a lot of operational expenses here that can be cut. We still have quarterly rewards and quarterly bonuses that are still being done in different federal organizations. So it's funny, but our approach is still to paying salaries like, let's leave them at the level of the previous year, maybe index them by inflation for 2% or something. And nobody really checks the bonus lines, the ones that are optionally spent to increase the salaries. Right, that's another angle. And when we have 300 companies, let's say, how many police officers do we need, right? Perhaps you don't need as much police as we do. Maybe we need a third of that. Right, so a third, yeah. Because when they're overly saturated, they start inventing job for themselves. They just go and they write papers and they have to do something, right? So they invent job for themselves, and then it falls as a headache on businesses, and then business needs to write answers, suggestions, and go to court with them. Right, instead of going to business and making money and generating profit, they're spending time fighting the bureaucracy. And business also suffers from the aerial raid interruptions, from the martial law at night when nobody can move and work and stuff. So, right? And then there are also regulatory expenses because in order to fulfill all the norms of our law, you need to keep paying money to do that. So that is a different burden. I would say a question is, what country do we want to build as the result? Imagine we succeeded. We succeeded in fighting back and we held our country. So we need then people who'd be able to go zoom out as high as possible and create these structures, create these chains that will help the country to grow. Thankfully, we finally have some companies now that work across the world that bring some money back home. But the companies like that, they would appreciate if we provided them capability to have a good back office here. And unfortunately, our Ukrainian office proposition is catastrophically unattractive. For example, bankruptcy law, I'll go back in history. Englishmen invented Form Ltd, limited company. So your liability is limited by the amount of money you put into that business initially. So that was the picture that we had up until recently. And then they added another norm into the bankruptcy law about collective responsibility of the limited liability company members with all their property. Right, so that doesn't work anymore as it was before. Exactly. So now, with one motion of the legislature, any foreigner who comes to the country, creates a business, makes investments. For example, a missile hits his company or something happens and he doesn't make money and he has to bankrupt and close his company. He is now responsible with all his property around the world for the debts he accrued here in Ukraine. So how would you expect to attract people to this country then? Come here, we'll take your feathers? Yeah, like geese, right, exactly. So we're turning into some weird economic ghetto here. And that one was copied from Russia. This, I would say, was a preparation for Russia to come here so that they could chase all those who are against them around the world. That's what they do in Russia. They are using that left and right. Collective responsibility. That's another one. If you as a company is responsible for what you produce, and they're telling you no, you're also responsible for your suppliers and for your buyers. So if some of your suppliers does something wrong, or one of your buyers does something wrong, you will be liable for the risks and for the payments. And they're not affixing or limiting this amount of risk monetarily. So if somebody made a mistake worth of 10,000 and you're a company that makes millions, guess how much will they charge you? And it'll be a decision by a federal tax service. Right, so it's not even on a person base. Sometimes it could be a commission, yeah. And commission is also a collective body, and it'll be a collective irresponsibility in this case. So what we have in the end, we have a country where mechanisms of limited liability do not work. We have a country where without a court decision, your property can be taken away, your business can be taken away, regardless of how much your investment was. Then who would come here and what for? Right, and why would those who still live here continue their business? Well, yeah, they are tormented. They are invested, right, already time and money. They have teams, they have people whom they work with, and now they're being fleeced. And they're trying to fight back and see what to do. What can they do? They're trying to fight for their right now. Unfortunately, if we will not communicate on the horizontal lines, on the horizontal communications between us, we will break the law of physics, as I say. The force of action is exactly equal to the force of counteraction. We need to be the counteraction to the government. You mean business, right? Yeah, civil society. Those people who see perspectives, see these chains in our country. They want to build them, but they want transparency and they want equal conditions, equal terms. They will start. The rest will come and follow. But for that, to do that, to fight that, one needs to have a certain level of development, right? Call it brain development or whatever. But you have to be able to create certain virtual models and analyze them in your mind. Because one thing is to build a plane. Another thing is to build a whole system of control and management, air traffic control and passenger service. That's a different level. You have to control a lot of things. Keep in mind logistics, transportation, airports, hubs. So here one would need to see and think in terms of systems. We'll need to look at the systems, find ways to build it, find ways to make it successful and profitable. Because it's easy to break one, but it's much harder to create one. So in order to create a system, one would need to, for example, look at the things, I guess, in a simple way. We have big companies that generate so much profit. How can we help them? How can we help them make more money? Right, we need to communicate with the leaders of these companies, ask questions. You have budgets, plans, strategy for development. What do you want? What is hindering you? How can we help you? Yeah, there is some water there if you need. In my opinion, it's kind of libertarian. I think it should be just don't interfere, don't drag down on business, right? Unfortunately, in my opinion, our government is often performing a limiting function on the economy. So you don't even need to go for examples too far. Gitmantsev was making a speech last week, and he says that we will be determining who is an honest exporter and who is not an honest exporter. And we'll only be letting the honest exporters to conduct business. This, I think, is straight corruption. Because if you have a bureaucrat defining who is honest, who is not, you're basically working on the level of Russian missiles, prohibiting businesses to stop make money, to make money. You're just blocking business from access to money. I think blocking as a class, as an option for the bureaucracy should be cancelled. It should not be able to block business activity. But the question need to be posed wider, I think. Our task as a country is not only to survive, but also to organize a sustainable development of the country and its growth, economic growth, first of all. Because if we continue staying in the same stage that we are now, we will not be able to fight Russia. We need to find a way to get to a trajectory of growth. And of course, theoretically, some peace agreement may help here, but if we are not changing our ideology, how we are managing the processes now, the world and peace will not help us. You mean peace agreement may win us some time to rebuild the economy and rebuild the government structure? I just want to clear it up a little. Right, that could be the idea, but it would not work, in my opinion, because if we have not changed in war times, I don't think we'll have enough stimulus to change in peace times. That's why I'm thinking these processes need to go already now. But unfortunately, we do not see any of them. And looking at the budget of 2024, we're not seeing that it's happening. Well, they're trying. They're trying. We can see that they're making some choices there. But overall, it's the same copy from the previous year with minor deviations, right? Right.